Chapter 3 of Abbotsford and Newstead Abbey by Washington Irving. This Librivox Recording is in the public domain. Recording by Greg Giordano. Abbotsford, Part 3. At dinner, Scott had laid by his half-rustic dress, and appeared clad in black. The girls, too, in completing their toilet, had twisted in their hair the sprigs of purple heather which they had gathered on the hillside, and looked all fresh and blooming from their breezy walk. There was no guest at dinner but myself. Around the table were 2 or 3 dogs in attendance. Mida, the old staghound, took his seat at Scott's elbow, looking up wistfully in his master's eye, while Finette, the pet spaniel, placed herself near Mrs. Scott, by whom I soon perceived she was completely spoiled. The conversation happening to turn on the merits of his dogs, Scott spoke with great feeling and affection of his favorite, Camp, who was depicted by his side in the earlier engravings of him. He talked of him as of a real friend whom he had lost, and Sophia Scott, looking up archly in his face, observed that Papa shed a few tears when poor Camp died. I may here mention another testimonial of Scott's fondness for his dogs, and his humorous mode of showing it, which I subsequently met with. Rambling with him one morning about the grounds adjacent to the house, I observed a small antique monument, on which was inscribed, in Gothic characters, Sigit le brave Percy. Here lies the brave Percy. I paused, supposing it to be the tomb of some stark warrior of the olden time, but Scott drew me on. "Pooh!" cried he, "it's nothing but one of the monuments of my nonsense, of which you'll find enough hereabouts." I learned afterward that it was the grave of a favorite greyhound. Among the other important and privileged members of the household who figured in attendance at the dinner was a large grey cat, who, I observed, was regaled from time to time with titbits from the table. This sage grimalkin was a favorite of both master and mistress, and slept at night in their room, and Scott laughingly observed that one of the least wise parts of their establishment was, that the window was left open at night for puss to go in and out. The cat assumed a kind of ascendancy among the quadrupeds, sitting in state in Scott's armchair, and occasionally stationing himself on a chair beside the door, as if to review his subjects as they passed, giving each dog a cuff beside the ears as he went by. This clapper clawing was always taken in good part. It appeared to be, in fact, a mere act of sovereignty on the part of Grimalkin, to remind the others of their vassalage, which they acknowledged by the most perfect acquiescence. A general harmony prevailed between sovereign and subjects, and they would all sleep together in the sunshine. Scott was full of anecdote and conversation during dinner. He made some admirable remarks upon the Scottish character, and spoke strongly in praise of the quiet, orderly, honest conduct of his neighbors, which one would hardly expect, said he, from the descendants of moss troopers and borderers, in a neighborhood famed in old times for brawl and feud, and violence of all kinds. He said he had, in his official capacity of sheriff, administered the laws for a number of years, during which there had been very few trials. The old feuds and local interests and rivalries and animosities of the Scotch, however, still slept, he said, in their ashes, and might easily be roused. Their hereditary feeling for names was still great. It was not always safe to have even the game of football between villages. The old clannish spirit was too apt to break out. The Scotch, he said, were more revengeful than the English. They carried their resentments longer, and would sometimes lay them by for years, but would be sure to gratify them in the end. The ancient jealousy between the Highlanders and the Lowlanders still continued to a certain degree, the former looking upon the latter as an inferior race, less brave and hardy, but at the same time suspecting them of a disposition to take airs upon themselves under the idea of superior refinement. This made them tetchy and ticklish company for a stranger on his first coming among them, ruffling up and putting themselves upon their mettle, on the slightest occasion, so that he had in a manner to quarrel and fight his way into their good graces. He instanced a case in point in a brother of Mungo Park, who went to take up his residence in a wild neighbourhood of the Highlands. He soon found himself considered as an intruder, and that there was a disposition among these cocks of the hills to fix a quarrel on him, trusting that, being a Lowlander, he would show the white feather. For a time he bore their flings and taunts with great coolness, until one, presuming on his forbearance, drew forth a dirk, and holding it before him, asked him if he had ever seen a weapon like that in his part of the country. Park, who was a Hercules in frame, seized the dirk, and with one blow drove it through an oaken table. "Yes," replied he, "and tell your friends that a man from Lowlands drove it where the devil himself cannot draw it out again." All persons were delighted with the feat, and the words that accompanied it. They drank with Park to a better acquaintance, and were staunch friends ever afterwards. After dinner we adjourned to the drawing-room, which served also for study and library. Against the wall on one side was a long writing-table, with drawers, surmounted by a small cabinet of polished wood, with folding doors richly studded with brass ornaments, within which Scott kept his most valuable papers. Above the cabinet, in a kind of niche, was a complete corslet of glittering steel, with a closed helmet and flanked by gauntlets and battle-axes. Around were hung trophies and relics of various kinds, a scimitar of Tippoo Sahib, a Highland broadsword from Flodden Field, a pair of Ripon spurs from Bannockburn, and above all, a gun which had belonged to Rob Roy, and bore his initials R.M.G., an object of peculiar interest to me at the time, as it was understood Scott was actually engaged in printing a novel founded on the story of that famous outlaw. On each side of the cabinet were bookcases, well stored with works of romantic fiction in various languages, many of them rare and antiquated. This, however, was merely his cottage library, the principal part of his books being at Edinburgh. From this little cabinet of curiosities, Scott drew forth a manuscript picked up on the field of Waterloo, containing copies of several songs popular at the time in France. The paper was dabbled with blood. "The very life-blood, very possibly," said Scott, "of some gay young officer, who had cherished these songs as a keepsake from some lady love in Paris." He adverted, in a mellow and delightful manner, to the little half-gay, half-melancholy campaigning song, said to have been composed by General Wolfe, and sung by him at the mess table on the eve of the storming of Quebec, in which he fell so gloriously. "Why, soldiers, why, should we be melancholy, boys? Why, soldiers, why, whose business 'tis to die? For should next campaign send us to him who made us, boys, we're free from pain, but should we remain, a bottle and kind landlady makes all well again." "So," added he, "the poor lad who fell at Waterloo, in all probability, had been singing these songs in his tent the night before the battle, and thinking of the fair dame who had taught him them, and promising himself, should he outlive the campaign, to return to her all glorious from the wars." I find since that Scott published translations of these songs among some of his smaller poems. The evening passed away delightfully in this quaint-looking apartment, half study, half drawing-room. Scott read several passages from the old romance of Arthur, with a fine, deep, sonorous voice, and a gravity of tone that seemed to suit the antiquated black-letter volume. It was a rich treat to hear such a work, read by such a person, and in such a place, and his appearance as he sat reading, in a large arm-chair, with his favorite hound Maida at his feet, and surrounded by books and relics and border trophies, would have formed an admirable and most characteristic picture. While Scott was reading, the sage grimalkin, already mentioned, had taken his seat in a chair beside the fire, and remained with fixed eye and grave demeanor, as if listening to the reader. I observed to Scott that his cat seemed to have a black-letter taste in literature. "Ah," said he, "these cats are a very mysterious kind of folk. There is always more passing in their minds than we are aware of. It comes no doubt from their being so familiar with witches and warlocks." He went on to tell a little story about a gudeman who was returning to his cottage one night, when, in a lonely out-of-the-way place, he met with a funeral procession of cats all one mourning, bearing one of their race to the grave in a coffin covered with a black velvet pall. The worthy man, astonished and half frightened at so strange a pageant, hastened home and told what he had seen to his wife and children. Scarce had he finished when a great black cat that sat beside the fire raised himself up, exclaimed, "Then I am king of the cats," and vanished up the chimney. The funeral seen by the good man was one of the cat dynasty. "Our grimalkin here," added Scott, "sometimes reminds me of the story, by the airs of sovereignty which he assumes, and I am apt to treat him with respect from the idea that he may be a great prince incognito, and may some time or another come to the throne." In this way Scott would make the habits and peculiarities of even the dumb animals about him subjects for humorous remark or whimsical story. Our evening was enlivened also by an occasional song from Sophia Scott, at the request of her father. She never wanted to be asked twice, but complied frankly and cheerfully. Her songs were all Scotch, sung without any accompaniment, in a simple manner, but with great spirit and expression, and in their native dialects, which gave them an additional charm. It was delightful to hear her carol off in sprightly style, and with an animated air, some of those generous-spirited old Jacobite songs, once current among the adherents of the Pretender in Scotland, in which she is designated by the appellation of the Young Chevalier. These songs were much relished by Scott, notwithstanding his loyalty, for the unfortunate Chevalier has always been a hero of romance with him, as he has with many other staunch adherents to the House of Hanover, now that the Stuart line has lost all its terrors. And speaking on this subject, Scott mentioned as a curious fact, that, among the papers of the Chevalier, which had been submitted by government to his inspection, he had found a memorial to Charles from some adherents in America, dated 1778, proposing to set up his standard in the back settlements. I regret that, at the time, I did not make more particular inquiries of Scott on the subject. The document in question, however, in all probability, still exists among the Pretender's papers, which are in the possession of the British government. In the course of the evening Scott related the story of a whimsical picture hanging in the room, which had been drawn for him by a lady of his acquaintance. It represented the doleful perplexity of a wealthy and handsome young English knight of the olden time, who, in the course of a border foray, had been captured and carried off to the castle of a hard-headed and high-handed old baron. The unfortunate youth was thrown into a dungeon, and a tall gallows erected before the castle gate for his execution. When all was ready, he was brought into the castle hall where the grim baron was seated in state, with his warriors armed to the teeth around him, and was given his choice, either to swing on the gibbet or to marry the baron's daughter. The last may be thought an easy alternative, but unfortunately the baron's young lady was hideously ugly, with a mouth from ear to ear, so that not a suitor was to be had for her, either for love or money, and she was known throughout the border country by the name of Muckle-mouthed Mag. The picture in question represented the unhappy dilemma of the handsome youth. Before him sat the grim baron, with a face worthy of the father of such a daughter, and looking daggers and ratsbane. On one side of him was Muckle-mouthed Mag, with an amorous smile across the whole breadth of her countenance, and a leer enough to turn a man to stone. On the other side was the father confessor, a sleek friar, jogging the youth's elbow, and pointing to the gallows, seen in perspective through the open portal. The story goes that after long laboring in mind, between the altar and the halter, the love of life prevailed, and the youth resigned himself to the charms of muckle-mouthed Mag. Contrary to all the probabilities of romance, the match proved a happy one. The Baron's daughter, if not beautiful, was a most exemplary wife. Her husband was never troubled with any of those doubts and jealousies which sometimes mar the happiness of connubial life, and was made the father of a fair and undoubtedly legitimate hue which still flourishes on the border. I give but a faint outline of the story from vague recollections. It may, perchance, be more richly related elsewhere, by some one who may retain something of the delightful humour with which Scott recounted it. When I retired for the night, I found it almost impossible to sleep. The idea of being under the roof of Scott, of being on the borders of the Tweed, in the very centre of that region which had for some time past been the favourite scene of romantic fiction, and, above all, the recollections of the ramble I had taken, the company in which I had taken it, and the conversation which had passed, all fermented in my mind, and nearly drove sleep from my pillow. End of Chapter 3. Recording by Greg Giordano. Newport Richey, Florida.